you can bet the farm that we'll have other compounds for you to try that you can still call yourself half-natty because they're not specified. And then we can still end up looking phenomenal in peak physical shape and compete at the highest level of performance, right? Because we're 10 steps ahead of WADA and USADA. Vigorous Steve here with an updated half-natty stack that's WADA approved as of 2022, because the World Anti-Doping Agency has already released their prohibited list of 2022. I'll link it down below so you can give it a download and a read for yourself if you want to. Now, I've took my fair time to analyze this updated prohibited list and see what has changed from the prohibited list of 2021 to next year. Because I already made a half-natty stack video that's WADA approved based on the previous prohibited list. But a lot has changed, right? Certain segments have been more clearly specified. Particular drugs have been added. But I've also learned a lot of new compounds and pharmacology in the meantime. So we're due for an update. Most specifically, BPC 157 has been added to the prohibited list of next year. So last year was not mentioned on the list, so we're technically still able to use it and call yourself a drug-free athlete. Now, to preface this video, I just want to make it absolutely clear that this list is not going to mean that you're going to pass the drug test if you're competing in a drug-tested federation that follows USADA or WADA guidelines. These are just compounds which are not specifically mentioned. If they fall under a specific category, I will mention that accordingly. So keep that in mind. You're just going to be natty on paper. You can call yourself a half-natty to your friends and your gym bros, but I highly doubt you're going to pass a drug test. And again, when in doubt, run any of these compounds through the Wikipedia pages where they document the doping cases in particular sports, whether that's Olympics or cycling or other sports like baseball or mixed martial arts, for example, to other sports where doping is quite common. So if you're in doubt, and you want to confirm whether a compound is being detected, there's a test for it, right? There's a test in one of the WADA accredited labs. Run those compounds through the list down below to see if people are getting popped and failing drug tests for these particular compounds. Again, I just listed all the compounds which are not specifically mentioned. So you guys can call yourself a half-natty as of 2022. And before we get into it, please like the video, leave a comment for the algorithm, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. I briefly want to discuss segment 0, the non-approved substances of the prohibited list of 2022. These are prohibited at all times, whether that's in or out of competition, and all prohibited substances in this class are specified substances. Again, if you go to the index of the prohibited list, you find many compounds mentioned specifically, but in this segment, they say that any pharmacological substance which is not addressed by any of the subsequent sections of the list, and with no current approval by any governmental regulatory health authority for human therapeutic use, whether that's drugs under preclinical or clinical development or being discontinued, designer drugs, substances approved only for veterinary use, are prohibited at all times. This class covers many different substances, including, but not limited to, BPC 157, which is a segment of body protection compound produced in the intestinal tract, right? Generally used for healing, angiogenesis, to lower inflammation, usually used concurrently with TB500, which is a segment of thymosin beta 4. So basically, any compound that's not currently FDA approved is automatically prohibited. So keep that in mind. Many of the compounds that we'll discuss later on, they might have undergone clinical trials and were discontinued or never investigated, or certainly are not FDA approved anywhere in the world, but somehow they're available on the gray area scene. So technically, many of them are not approved based on this prohibited list, but they're not specifically mentioned. So for the sake of calling ourselves a half-natty, we can see that through the fingers and just proceed ahead. Let's start with optimizing our HPTA, hypothalamic pituitary testes axis, and the adrenal axis where we'll add it. because we can't use anabolic androgenic steroids. All of the known anabolic androgenic steroids are on the prohibited list. But what we can do is optimize our natural testosterone production and manipulate our estradiol and DHT conversion to keep the highest possible serum testosterone levels possible, right? To the point it doesn't cause further negative feedback, to the point LH and FSH concentrations drop. So I'll put on the screen an entire supplement stack that you can follow to optimize your testosterone production, being 300 to 600 milligrams KSM-66 ashwagandha root extract, which is the most studied version of ashwagandha root extract and seems to have the most data behind it, that it's able to raise serum testosterone concentrations. 400 to 800 milligrams Tongkat Ali, also plenty of clinical evidence that it can raise testosterone concentrations. 600 to 1200 milligrams Fedosia agrestis. It's a little bit become more popular due to Dr. Huberman. But these three in combination should significantly raise your testosterone production. Personally, I didn't experiment with Tongkat Ali or Fedosia agrestis when I came off cycle, but now that I've talked to several other people that are still drug-free and only want to get the most out of their endogenous testosterone production, the combination of these three, ashwagandha root, Tongkat Ali, and Fedosia agrestis, is able to raise serum concentrations anywhere between 5% to sometimes even 25%, but that's in combination with the Icing the Testicles protocol, which I'll link at the end of this video. 3 to 6 milligrams of boron to bring the sex-hormone binding globulin concentrations down a little bit, freeing up a little bit of testosterone, which could potentially increase performance to a certain extent. Again, you don't want to lower SAHBG to 0, which is very difficult when you're not taking exogenous steroids. But 3 to 6 milligrams of boron per day has the capacity to lower sex-hormone binding globulin levels a little bit favorably, raising free testosterone concentrations, which ultimately increase libido. Will it increase performance? Maybe ever so slightly, but well, every percent in this stack is highly beneficial. 5,000 IUs vitamin D3, 2,000 milligrams oral carnitine L-tartrate or 500 milligrams injectable carnitine, 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams magnesium bisglycinate on top of the magnesium that you're getting from your food. Most people would get around 600, maybe even 800 milligrams of magnesium from dietary sources already, and then you supplement additional magnesium on top. The bisglycinate version seems to be the most orally bioavailable version of magnesium supplements. And again, keep in mind, if you notice a little bit of diarrhea, right, and loose stool, that means you're over-supplementing your magnesium, your body is not absorbing it, and you need to take it down a notch because you've reached your maximum tolerable dose of magnesium supplements, and whatever else you're not using gets excreted through the stool and it holds a little bit of water in place. Right, so anywhere between 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams magnesium bisglycinate on top of your dietary intake, 25 to even 100 milligrams of zinc picolinate. Most people would get away with 25 milligrams of zinc picolinate, but if you're a little bit zinc deficient and you really want to optimize testosterone production, consider raising the dose to 50 milligrams zinc picolinate, maybe even 100 milligrams zinc picolinate. And then bring that back when you do your blood work and you see that your testosterone levels have kind of tapered to the maximum range you can produce endogenously, right, naturally, without any ACG or HMG in the picture, which are unfortunately on the prohibited list. Right, so you're just trying to optimize your nutrient profile in the testicles, so to say. And maybe you need to front load your zinc picolinate, and then as your testosterone levels kind of taper and reach their maximum potential, then you bring it back down to 25 milligrams zinc picolinate. And the same can be said for vitamin E and selenium. You can increase to 800 IUs vitamin E from the mixed tocopherols and tocotrienols. I can't really find any clinical data that shows that tocopherols over tocotrienols or vice versa are more beneficial regarding testosterone production and semen quality. So I would say that the mix of both should raise the antioxidant status of the testicles, allowing for the maximum amount of testosterone production and the highest fertility regarding your semen parameters. Then you can bring that back to 400 IUs. And with selenium, you have to figure out how much selenium you're getting from your dietary sources. And when you're eating a lot of animal protein, Most people already get 400, maybe even 600 micrograms of selenium simply from their diet alone. So you don't need to supplement as much selenium on top. Most people would get away with 200 milligrams or 200 micrograms selenium per day on top of their diet. But if you're following a particular diet that's a little bit devoid in selenium, you might even want to increase the selenium intake from supplemental sources to 800 micrograms. So again, determine how much selenium you're getting from your diet and then supplement on top to, let's say, 400 micrograms, 600 micrograms in total, and to a maximum of 800 micrograms for a couple weeks until you do your blood work and you see that your testosterone levels are tapering off. Then you bring the selenium down to a maintenance dose. 3,000 to 5,000 milligrams of taurine. I would say 5,000 milligrams of taurine pre-workout is the sweet spot for most people. And as silly as it sounds, you can optimize this entire over-the-counter supplement protocol for testosterone production by icing your testicles 3 times per day for 20 minutes. I was able to raise my testosterone concentrations with approximately 20%. I've received blood work from a lot of people saying anything between a 10% to even 30% increase. Again, that's with all of these supplements in place. And so that's quite a dramatic effect. I'll link the dedicated video for icing the testicles at the end of this video, so feel free to give that a watch. Long story short, you wrap an ice pack in a towel, you strategically place that underneath your testicles for 20 minutes at a time, 3 times per day, and it works in a similar way to how you're removing the inflammation from a sports injury by placing a cold pack there and then allowing that area to heat up, bringing new nutrients with increased blood flow to that area. So the cold removes the inflammation, and as the blood goes back to the area to heat it up, it brings all these nutrients in the form of the over-the-counter supplements, which are known to work and increase testosterone production, and the antioxidants, and, hopefully a little bit of cholesterol in the process to synthesize neurosteroids and sex hormones from, right? Give it some thought. I know that it works. Other people know that it works, and it doesn't cost anything. And none of these supplements or this icing the testicles protocol can be found on the prohibited list of 2022. Now, we've maximized our natural testosterone production. Now we got to keep it that way because the body tends to aromatize that in either estradiol or dihydrotestosterone through 5-alpha reductase activity. So we can reduce aromatization by, bringing our body fat levels down. And that's where a lot of the aromatization occurs. So the leaner you are, the less potential for aromatization you have. You can consider a supplement of 100 to 200 milligrams dinyl methane. Because again, keep in mind that estradiol is one of the primary mechanisms which the hypothalamus and pituitary downregulates the secretion of a luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. So there's something to say for keeping your serum estradiol levels as low as possible, not super low to the point you lose out on anabolism or your lipids get horrible or you change your blood pressure parameters, right? We're just trying to optimize your estradiol, estrone, and estriol concentrations. You can take a supplement called the dinyl methane, 100 to 200 milligrams per day, which helps with estrogen balance by promoting the conversion of estradiol into either estriol or esterone. So technically, that should minimize the downregulatory effect that estradiol has on your hypothalamic pituitary testes axis while you're using all of these over-the-counter supplements and an icing the testicles protocol, raising the amount of testosterone that's present in serum, which of course has a potential to aromatize into estradiol, which downregulates a further LH and FSH secretion. So we're trying to optimize this the best way we can. Ideally, you would use an aromatase inhibitor in the form of an Arimidex, a letrozole, an Aromacin, for example. But all of the aromatase inhibitors, which are medicinal aromatase inhibitors being prescribed in medical cases, those are all on the prohibited list of 2022 and have been on the list for a very long time. So the only real option we have to actually reduce aromatase activity, besides reducing your body fat levels, is to use nicotine in the form of gum, patches, or, in the form of a vape pen or cigarette, which I would advise everybody to avoid. I can't really give you dosages because, nicotine and its effect on reducing aromatization is highly person dependent. There's other compounds which are known to help, including zinc, vitamin E, hesperidin, and a couple other flavonoids which I'll put on the screen right here. So a combination of these should reduce aromatase activity and preserve the testosterone from aromatizing into estradiol, right? So now you have a higher serum testosterone concentration because you're preventing the conversion into estradiol. So nicotine, gum, or patches is an option. Keep in mind that nicotine is included in the 2022 monitoring program, as mentioned in segment 6, being stimulants underneath the exceptions. So nicotine, even though it's being monitored, it's currently not prohibited. So you can still use it and call yourself a natty, trying to optimize their natural testosterone production the best way possible, right? And preserve that testosterone by preventing the conversion into estradiol. You can consider 320 milligrams salt palmetto or 640 milligrams salt palmetto in combination with 100 to 200 milligrams pygium, which are known to inhibit the conversion of testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, preserving a little bit of testosterone in the process. And again, right, how much of a conversion you're able to mitigate with these over-the-counter supplements, that remains to be determined. That's mostly studied in the context of hair loss. If you have a lot of conversion of testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, you might need to use a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor in the form of finasteride or dutasteride, which are surprisingly not specifically mentioned on the prohibited list of 2022. Now, fair warning for the guys who are thinking about using a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor to raise their testosterone concentrations to the absolute top or slightly over their reference range, right, by preserving the testosterone, preventing the conversion into dihydrotestosterone. Keep in mind that finasteride and dutasteride have been linked to prolonged sexual dysfunction even after these compounds are discontinued. It's called post-finasteride syndrome or post-dutasteride syndrome. And whether that's due to epigenetic changes in the 5-alpha reductase enzymes or chronic reduction of dihydrotestosterone levels, it's just something you need to be aware of before you start incorporating these compounds. So even though they're not on the prohibited list, they might cause severe side effects for prolonged periods of time that you then need to address with actual pharmacology that's certainly on the prohibited list. So please be warned, right? Maybe salt palmetto, pygium, and nicotine, for example, will prevent the aromatization and 5-alpha reductase conversion of testosterone into either estradiol or dihydrotestosterone, keeping serum concentrations as high as possible. But beyond that, well, you're taking a risk, so to say. You can even boost your HPTA with a selective estrogen receptor modulator, which is not specifically mentioned, but it will certainly fall under segment 3.2 aromatase inhibitors and selective estrogen receptor modulators, being Enclomiphene. So raloxifene is mentioned, tormophene is mentioned, clomiphene is mentioned, tamoxifen, Nolvadex is mentioned, but Enclomiphene is not specifically mentioned, and it's FDA approved in particular parts of the world. So, right, technically it's not listed, but if you want to boost your HPTA and right, we're bending the rules a little bit. 50 milligrams Enclomiphene before bed will raise your LH and FSH secretion to the point. All of the before mentioned supplements will certainly make a difference, right? And level you up to way beyond the reference range if your testicles are agreeable to such a protocol. Now for anabolism, right, now we've optimized the HPTA for actual anabolism, besides the serum testosterone and the estradiol, which is now completely optimized, we can look into terkesterone and ecdysteroids, which are not on the list. Still not on the list, and sold over the counter at Gorilla Mind. And even though a lot of copycats have surfaced since we've been trialing terkesterone and ecdysteroids here at the Gorilla Mind team, a lot of copycats on the market. None of those have been complexed with the hydroxypropyl beta cyclodextrin formula that's unique to Intelligent Elephant and Gorilla Mind, which increases its bioavailability and its potency. So let's say you were running 300 milligrams terkesterone from our brand, being Gorilla Mind, and you switch to another brand, you probably need to increase the dose because, again, they're not as orally bioavailable as our formula. So whether you choose between 300 milligrams terkesterone per day or 300 milligrams ecdysterone per day, that seems to be the sweet spot for men, where the sweet spot for women is around 200 milligrams. So whether you choose the terkesterone or the ecdysteroids, you're now potentiating anabolism through the estrogen beta receptor pathway, stimulating collagen synthesis downstream. So you're activating the androgen receptor with the highest testosterone level you could possibly have. You're stimulating the estrogen alpha and beta receptor with a little bit of endogenous estradiol, which is not too high to suppress your HPTA, certainly not if you're using Enclomiphene, which is blocking these receptors. Now I know what you're thinking. Can I combine terkesterone or ecdysterone with a selective estrogen receptor modulator? And the answer is yes. I actually know several people who ran terkesterone or ecdysterone while they were doing their post-cycle therapy using 50 to 100 milligrams Clomid or 50 to 100 milligrams Enclomiphene per day. Because Enclomiphene or Clomid have a higher affinity for the estrogen alpha receptor over the estrogen beta receptor. They will still block it or activate it to a certain extent depending on the tissue that they activate it in or block it in. But at a dose of 50 milligrams per day, you see that terkesterone or ecdysterone still potentiate all of its effects through the estrogen beta receptor, and you get the expected anabolism compared to when you're not running a selective estrogen receptor modulator, albeit that SARMs are linked to reduced serum IGF-1 levels, obviously, right? So you lose a little bit of anabolism through that pathway. But terkesterone and ecdysteroids, whether you use 50 milligrams Enclomiphene or Clomid or not, will still potentiate their anabolic effects. Consider 2 to 5 milligrams of oral micronized progesterone sublingually up to twice per week. If you start to do oral micronized progesterone daily, you might experience HPTA downregulation. Again, you're raising your progesterone concentrations to supraphysiological levels. Progesterone is not on the prohibited list, luckily, because it's a bioidentical hormone. And I've noticed that dosages of 2 to 5 milligrams oral micronized, right, through sublingual administration, potentiate a little bit of anabolism if you take that post-workout, but I would limit that to once or twice per week. Any further and more frequent dosing beyond that could potentially downregulate the HPTA, resulting in a lower testosterone concentration, which is where most of the anabolism is going to come from in this half-natty stack. Now, a lot of SARMs are not specifically mentioned on the list. So if you're going to base your restrictions of what is considered half-natty and what is not, right, what is full-blown enhanced, based on what is specifically mentioned on the doping list of 2022, you should still be able to use BMS 564929 or AC 262356 or LGD 2226 or LGD 3303 or S40503 or S23 or acetothiolutamide or LG 121071 or TFM4AS1, and even YK11 is not specifically mentioned on the prohibited list of 2022. Now, of course, all of these fall under segment 1.2, being the anabolic agents or selective androgen receptor modulators. But again, how far are you willing to push boundaries? I'll leave that up to you. These are not specifically mentioned. And right, as long as you're not undergoing a USADA or WADA doping test, you should still technically be able to call yourself a half-natty while running these at whatever doses you feel comfortable with. Dopamine receptor agonists, cabergoline, pramipexole, bromocriptine, not on the doping list. I don't see a reason to run these compounds, even though they're not specifically mentioned, because we use these to combat side effects of nandrolone or trenbolone or ment, right, trestolone, raising prolactin levels. And I don't think that 2 to 5 milligrams of oral micronized progesterone sublingually twice per week will alter your prolactin levels to a dramatic extent. But if you end up using kratom, which is also not on the prohibited list, cannabis, marijuana is on the prohibited list, mentioned specifically in segment 8, cannabinoids, that it's no cannabis, no CBD with THC, but kratom, not specifically mentioned, which is also known to raise prolactin levels. So let's say you're on the kratom tea daily and you use oral micronized progesterone daily, prolactin levels might go up. And in that case, you might need a little bit of cabergoline to bring that prolactin level down so you can enjoy your sex life, right? Because high prolactin levels, and especially in combination with the prolonged finasteride exposure, might be a recipe for erectile dysfunction, right? And that's the last thing you want when you're going full-blown half-natty. Recovery aids. GHK and GHK copper, or PEL GHK, which is a topical administration of GHK without the copper, but it allows for seral permeability, right? So you can apply that topically, let's say on the elbow, and you get a little bit of a collagen synthesis locally. GHK and its variants are not on the prohibited list. You can use 5 to 20 milligrams GHK copper, for example, to stimulate collagen synthesis in particular areas. So even though TB500 and BPC157 are now prohibited, but well, we already have an alternative in the form of GHK. And it seems to be working quite well to enhance collagen synthesis in the areas that it's administered in. MK677, albuterol, is not specifically mentioned. Now, of course, I'm sure MK677 falls underneath segment 2.4 growth hormone releasing factors or under the SARMs section. Still not specifically mentioned, so technically, on paper, you should be able to use 30 milligrams MK677 before bed and call yourself a half-natty. You can optimize your growth factors by preventing their breakdown with a dipeptidylpeptidase 4 inhibitor, being linagliptin, or sexagliptin, or sitagliptin, vildagliptin. These four have a reasonably short active life, between 1.5 to 12 hours, allowing for daily administrations. Even berberine has some dipeptidylpeptidase 4 inhibitory effect, so you can consider 500 milligrams berberine before bed to inhibit the breakdown of particular growth factors. Now, these medications are not specifically mentioned on the prohibited list. They were not mentioned last year and not next year, but they might fall underneath segment 2.3, being the growth factor modulators. Right? So the gliptins are not specifically mentioned, but they might still fall under this particular class of drugs which are still prohibited. Now, the growth factors and preventing their breakdown increases levels of angiopoietin, epidermal growth factor, erythropoietin, EPO, which raises red blood cell count and hematocrit levels, fibroblast growth factor 1 to 23, growth hormone releasing hormone. Again, preventing the breakdown of growth hormone releasing hormone raises serum growth hormone concentrations downstream, because now you have an increased secreting effect of this hormone that you're, again, preventing the breakdown of. Hepatocyte growth factor, insulin, insulin-like growth factor 1 and 2, myostatin, which is something you probably don't want to inhibit the breakdown of, because myostatin limits the amount of muscle mass you can accrue. Brain-derived neurotropic factor, thrombopoietin. Again, might not want to inhibit thrombopoietin because it might increase clotting risk, especially if you're susceptible to having high hematocrit genetically. Incretins, being the gastric inhibitory polypeptides, or the glucagon-like peptide 1, which we'll discuss a little bit later, because those are not on the prohibited list either. But neither is MK677, so you might be able to get away with the following protocol: 30 milligrams MK677 before bed in combination with 500 milligrams berberine, which might be able to offset a little bit of the reduction of insulin sensitivity and the insulin resistance which occurs from frequent MK677 administrations. And then 2.5 to 5 milligrams linagliptin upon waking, which prevents the breakdown of insulin, IGF-1, growth hormone releasing hormone, increasing the overall effect of MK677, while helping to regulate this insulin resistance, which could manifest with prolonged exposure to MK677. So again, it might be a good combination to consider, even though they're technically not allowed, they're not specifically mentioned. So again, right, how far are you going to push the boundaries? We'll leave that up to you. Thyroid hormones, not specifically mentioned. You should be able to use 25 to 50 micrograms of thyroxine or 12.5 micrograms of T3, right, the triiodothyronine. Now, we're not going to raise these dosages to 100 micrograms T4 or 25 micrograms T3. Because keep in mind, the HPTA can only produce that much testosterone. You're only going to get that much additional anabolism from the terkesterone or the ecdysterone or the progesterone or the GHK copper or the MK677 for that matter. So I would limit this, if you're thinking about this half-natty stack, to very low amounts which are otherwise prescribed in the cases of hypothyroidism, right? Being 25 micrograms T4 and 12.5 micrograms T3 in the form of armored thyroid. That seems to be quite sustainable on endogenous testosterone levels and all the other hormones which are supplementing on top. Right? That should be sufficient. They're not mentioned on the list. You should be able to take them and still consider yourself a half-natty. And if you were to go to 25 or 100 micrograms of T3, you're probably ending up in a severe catabolic state because, again, there's no anabolic androgenic steroids to prevent that from happening. PDA5 inhibitors, tadalafil, sildenafil, vardenafil, not on the list. You should be able to use these, right? Whether that's to reduce your blood pressure or to give your third leg some incentive later in the day or to increase pumps in the gym. Whatever reason might be, they're not on the list. You are still a half-natty. Alpha-2 adrenergic antagonist, being the yohimbine and the ribosine. Not on the list. You can use those to stimulate fat loss or increase your workout capacity if needed. 3 to 6 milligrams yohimbine or 3 to 6 milligrams ribosine. I don't see a reason to combine either of those two. But what you can do to increase exercise performance is combine an alpha-2 adrenergic antagonist with an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist, being agmatine sulfate. So you can take 3 to 6 milligrams ribosine, which doesn't have so much side effects over yohimbine, with 500 milligrams to 750 milligrams agmatine sulfate, dosed about a half an hour before you do your workout. So even though you won't potentiate much fat loss by taking ribosine when you've already had several meals, you can stimulate and block the alpha-2 adrenergic receptors to the point you get increased exercise performance. And then we have the glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonists to suppress our appetite. Might be beneficial in all sports, but if you're preparing for a bodybuilding contest, highly beneficial. We can use 1 milligram semaglutide or 1.5 milligrams dulaglutide or 0.6 to 1.8 milligrams liraglutide, or even exenatide, which I'm not familiar with, but it's also on the market. And these 4 GLP-1 receptor agonists are not specifically mentioned on the doping list. So again, you can suppress your appetite all you want with these GLP-1 receptor agonists because all of the stimulants which we generally use in bodybuilding or fitness to suppress our appetite are all included on the prohibited list, right? So the Adderall and modafinil and everything else, phentermine, sibutramine, which are horrible compounds, but still used by some people to suppress their appetite, those are all included, and the GLP-1 receptor agonists are not. Still half-natty if you're using them. You can suppress your appetite further with melanotan 2, being a melanocortin receptor agonist, or you can boost your libido with PT141, also known as Vyleesi. And both of these work on the melanocortin receptors. Might cause a little bit of nausea, being melanotan 2 specifically, or might induce libido, albeit not as much as some of the other compounds, which we'll discuss a little bit later, being the PT141. Not on the doping list. You should be able to use them. You should be able to get a nice tan as a result of it. So if you ever see a guy competing in a drug-tested bodybuilding show and he's got a phenomenal base tan, well, it's not on the prohibited list, so that guy probably used milligrams of melanotan 2 to prepare for the contest and avoid that whole pro-tan debacle, which gets under your fingernails for weeks on end. 500 micrograms tesofensine, subcutaneous upon waking. This is a serotonin, noradrenaline, dopamine reuptake inhibitor with a 9-day half-life that primarily acts as an appetite suppressant. So similarly to a GLP-1 receptor agonist, especially when you get further down the line of dieting, 500 micrograms of tesofensine might be able to suppress your appetite further. Not specifically mentioned on the doping list. It doesn't potentiate any fat loss, so to say, but it could possibly act by increasing your resting energy expenditure And it's even undergone phase 2 clinical trials for the treatments of obesity, which have now been successfully completed. So keep that on your watch list. I haven't used that myself, but I will run a trial of tesofensine at one point in the near future. We can optimize our energy production with 10 to 20 milligrams of injectable adenosine triphosphate, ATP, which is technically allowed. Again, they specifically mentioned under segment 4.1 that the activators of the adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase, AMPK, are prohibited, but injectable adenosine triphosphate is a product of AMPK. Right? So you should be able to inject that directly. It's a very potent vasodilator, so keep that in mind. You might be hyperventilating a little bit. Salbutamol is on the prohibited list to a maximum of 1600 micrograms over 24 hours. Has a mild performance-enhancing effect, not as potent as clenbuterol or other stimulants mentioned on the prohibited list. Still, you're able to use up to 1600 micrograms salbutamol over a 24-hour period, and that should offer a slight boost of 1 to 2% in this overall picture of the Half-Natty stack. Metformin is not specifically mentioned. You should technically be able to use 500 milligrams metformin before bed, even in combination with 500 milligrams berberine if you so desire. But metformin might fall under the segment 4.1 activators of the AMP kinase. Or it might even fall under segment 4.2, being the insulins or insulin mimetics. Again, it's a little bit hard to classify. Metformin or glucophage is not specifically mentioned. So for now, I would say you would have the green light. We can inhibit our nicotinamide N-methyltransferase enzymes within the adipose tissue with 5-amino-1-MQ. Again, not specifically mentioned. 50 to even 200 milligrams of 5-amino-1-MQ is technically allowed and still approved in this Half-Natty stack. And there's a long list of performance-enhancing pre-workout supplements that are not on the prohibited list of 2022. Creatine monohydrate, citrulline malate, alpha-GPC with huperzine A, DMAE standing for dimethylethanol-amine. Many of these pre-workout supplements you could find at Gorilla Mind, whether that's Gorilla Mode Nitric or Gorilla Mode or Gorilla Mode Stim. Right? Gorilla Mind has plenty of pre-workout supplements, which are all WADA approved and can be a nice benefit to this Half-Natty stack. Synephrine, not on the list. Caffeine, not on the list. Even though they're on the 2022 monitoring program, they're still not prohibited. So if you want a little bit of a stimulatory effect, look into synephrine or caffeine. Oxytocin, not on the prohibited list. I already made a video about this. I'll link it at the end. Consider taking that before strenuous workouts to give you some incentive to finish that workout full steam ahead, right? Because it lowers a little bit your perception of pain and your pain tolerance increases. So for a heavy and strenuous leg workout or very long marathon, maybe oxytocin can help. And then last but not least, a long list of nootropics to help with the cognition or mitigate the post-exercise brain fog or increase hand-eye coordination, for example. 500 to 1,000 micrograms of Semax being a segment of the bioidentical hormone adrenocorticotropic hormone, or 500 to 100 micrograms Selank being bioidentical to a hormone called Tuftin. Consider 5 milliliters of cerebrolysin or more containing multiple nerve growth factors, including brain-derived neurotropic factor. Or look into 10 to 20 milligrams of dihexa dosed once or twice per week. Dihexa is also known to increase brain-derived neurotropic factor, albeit that the clinical data is quite limited at this point in time. From our personal experience, I would say that dihexa acts as a mild stimulant, especially with daily use. So after a week of use, it starts to act as a stimulant. I can't really compare what kind of stimulant or which stimulant that is. But I would say that I would get an invigorated feeling, sort of say. But I would also get a little bit of a headache from dihexa. So I'll report my anecdotal findings in a couple of weeks when I'm done trialing dihexa. For now, it's not on the prohibited list, so consider looking into it. Maybe dosed once per week after your leg workout where people are generally fatigued, which dihexa seems to be able to mitigate by providing a little bit of energy and upregulating a brain-derived neurotropic factor secretion in the brain. 5 to 10 milligrams donepezil, which is an Alzheimer medication which improves cognition as well, not on the doping list. 10 to 20 milligrams of Noopept, also not on the doping list. All of these nootropics are not specifically mentioned on the doping list as of 2022. Will they be included in 2023? You never know. So keep that in mind, guys. Whatever we just discussed is only Half-Natty for the year 2022. And when the World Anti-Doping Agency releases their prohibited list for 2023, I'll redo this video series. We can basically do a Half-Natty stack every year based on the updated prohibited list of WADA. And then see which of these compounds are no longer approved or no longer considered to be Half-Natty, as they're specifically mentioned on the prohibited list of 2023. So keep that in mind, right? It's Half-Natty now, but maybe not next year. In the meantime, I will do a ton of research to find new compounds that will potentially not end up on the prohibited list of next year. And then even if a couple of these compounds are scratched off the list, right? WADA scores a couple points on us. You can bet the farm that we'll have other compounds for you to try that you can still call yourself Half-Natty because they're not specified. And then we can still end up looking phenomenal in peak physical shape and compete at the highest level of performance, right? Because we're 10 steps ahead of WADA and USADA, and we will continue to do that every year. I'll leave it at that. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're looking for the most comprehensive guides to bodybuilding pharmacology, you can find the ebooks on my website, vigoroussteve.com/shop. Personalized advice always available through consultations. You can find the rates in the consultation section. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok at VigorSteve. A front double bicep for the Half-Natty Vigorous crew. Some of these compounds are present within. But, well, I would fail the doping test left and right because I'm on test and primo and a couple other compounds which are specifically mentioned. So there's nothing Half-Natty about this. This is full-blown enhanced bodybuilding, albeit that the dosages are reasonably moderate. I'll leave it at that. Vigorous crew, you guys know what to do. Much appreciated, much love, and I'll see you in the next video.